The Spiritual Guide of Miguel de Molinos. Book 3. Of Spiritual Martyrdoms, whereby God purges souls of contemplation, infused and passive, of perfect resignation, inward humility, divine wisdom, true annihilation, and eternal peace. Chapter 1. The difference between the outward and inward man. There are two sorts of spiritual persons, internal and external, those that seek God by without, by discourse, by imagination, and consideration. They endeavor mainly to get virtues, many abstinences, maceration of body and mortification of the senses. They give themselves to rigorous penance. They put on sackcloth, chastise the flesh by discipline, endeavor silence, bear the presence of God, forming him to present themselves in their idea of him, or their imagination, sometimes as a pastor, sometimes as a physician, and sometimes as a father and Lord. They delight to be continually speaking of God, very often making fervent acts of love, and all this is art and meditation. By this way they desire to be great, and by the power of voluntary and exterior mortifications they go in quest of sensible affections and warm sentiments, thinking that God resides only in them when they have them. This is the external way, and is the way of beginners. And though it be good, yet there is no arriving at perfection by it. Nay, there is not so much as one step towards it, as expertise shews in many that, after 50 years of this external exercise, are void of God, and full of themselves, having nothing of spiritual men, but just the name of such. There are others truly spiritual, which have passed by the beginnings of the interior way, which leads perfection and union with God, and to which the Lord called them by his infinite mercy, from that outward way in which before they exercised themselves. These men retired in the inward part of their souls, with true resignation into the hands of God, with a total putting off and forgetting even of themselves. Do always go with a raised spirit to the presence of the Lord, by the means of pure faith, without image, form, or figure, but with great assurance founded in tranquillity and rest eternal, in whose infused meeting and entertainment the Spirit draws with so much force, that it makes the soul contract inwardly, the heart, the body, and all the powers of it. These souls, as they are already passed by the interior mortification, and have been cleansed by God with the fire of tribulation, with infinite and horrible torments, all of them ordained by his hand, and after his way are masters of themselves, because they are entirely subdued and denied, which makes them live with great repose and eternal peace. And although in many occasions they feel resistance and temptations, yet they become presently victorious, because already souls of proof and endued with divine strength, the motions of passions cannot last long upon them. And although vehement temptations and troublesome suggestions of the enemy may persevere a long time about them, yet they are all conquered with infinite gain, God being he that fights within them. These souls have already procured themselves a great light, and a true knowledge of Christ our Lord, both of his divinity and his humanity. They exercise this infused knowledge with a quiet silence in the inward entertainment, and the superior part of their souls, with a spirit free from images and free from external representations, with a love that is pure and stripped of all creatures. They are raised also from outward actions to the love of humanity and divinity. So much as they enjoy they forget, and in all of it they find that they love their God with all their heart and spirit. These blessed and sublimated souls take no pleasure in being anything of the world, but contempt in being alone. And in being forsaken and forgotten by everybody, they live so disinterested and taken off that though they continually receive many supernatural graces, yet they are not changed. No, not at those inclinations, being just as if they had not received them. Keeping always in the inmost of their hearts a great lowliness and contempt of themselves. Always humbled in the depths of their own unworthiness and vileness, in the same manner that they are always quiet, serene, and possessed with evenness of mind in graces and favours extraordinary, as also in the most rigorous and bitter torments, there is no news that cheers them, no success that makes them sad. Tribulation never disturb them, nor the interior continual and divine communion make them vain and conceited. They remain always full of holy and filial fear, in a wonderful peace, constancy, and serenity. Chapter 2. In the external way, they take care to do continual acts of all the virtues, one after another, to get to the attainment of them. They pretend to purge imperfections with industries, proportional to destruction. They take care to root up interests one after the other with a different and contrary exercise. But though they endeavour never so much, they arrive at nothing, because we cannot do anything which is not imperfection and misery. But in the inward way, and loving entertainment in the presence divine, as is the Lord that he is his works, virtue is established. Interests are rooted up, imperfections are destroyed, and passions removed, which makes the soul free unexpectedly, and taken off when good occasions are represented, without so much as thinking of the good which God of his infinite mercy prepared for them. It must be known that these souls, though thus perfect, as they have the true light of God, yet by it they know profoundly their own miseries, weaknesses, and imperfections, and what they yet want to arrive at perfection, towards which they are walking. They are afflicted and abhor themselves. They exercise themselves in a loving fear of God, and contempt of themselves, but with a true hope in God, and disconfidence in themselves. The more they are humbled with true contempt and a knowledge of themselves, the more they please God, and arrive at a singular respect and veneration in his presence. Of all the good works that they do, and of all that they continually suffer, as well within as without, they make no manner of account before that divine presence. The continual exercise is to enter into themselves in God with quiet and silence, because there is his centre, habitation and delight. They make a greater account of this interior retirement than of speaking of God. They retire into that interior and secret centre of the soul, to know God and receive his divine influence with fear and loving reverence. If they go out only to know and to despise themselves. But few know that few are the souls which arrive at this happy state, because few there are that are willing to embrace contempt, and suffer themselves to be refined and purified. Upon which account, although there are many that enter into this interior way, yet 'tis a rare thing for a soul to go on, and not stick upon the entrance. The Lord said to a soul, "This inward way is tread by few. 'Tis so high a grace that none deserves it. Few walk in it, because 'tis no other than a death of the senses, and few there be that are willing to so die and be annihilated, in which disposition this is so sovereign a gift is founded. Herewith thou wilt receive thyself, and perfectly know the great difference which there is between the external and internal way, and how different that presence of God is which arises from meditation, from that which is infused and supernatural, arising from the interior and infused entertainment, and from passive contemplation. And lastly, you will know the great difference which is between the outward and inward man. Chapter 3. The means of obtaining peace eternal is not the delight of sense nor of spiritual consolation, but the denying of self-love. It is the saying of Saint Bernard, that to serve God is nothing else but to do good and to suffer evil. He that would go to perfection by the means of sweetness and consolation is mistaken. You must desire no other consolation from God than to end your life for His sake. In the state of true obedience and subjection, Christ our Lord's way was not that of sweetness and softness, nor did He invite us to any such, either by His words or by His example, when He said, "He that will come after me, let him deny himself, and let him take up his cross and follow me." The soul that would be united to Christ must be comfortable to Him, following Him in the way of suffering. Thou wilt scarce begin to relish the sweetness of divine love in prayer, but the enemy with his deceitful craftiness will be kindling in thy heart desires of the desert and solitude, that thou mayst without anybody's hindrance spread the sails to continual and delightful prayer. Open thine eyes, and consider that this counsel and desire is not conformable to the true counsel of Christ our Lord, who has not invited us to follow the sweetness and comfort of our own will, but the denying of ourselves. He that will follow me and come unto perfection, let him part with his own will wholly, and leaving all things, let him entirely submit to the yoke of obedience and subjection by means of self-denial, which is the truest cross. There are many souls dedicated to God, which receive from His hands great thoughts, visions, and mental elevations. And yet for all that, the Lord keeps from him the grace of working miracles, understanding hidden secrets, foretelling future contingencies as He communicates these things to other souls which have constantly gone through tribulations, temptations, and the true cross, in the state of perfect humility, obedience, and subjection. Oh, what a great happiness it is for a soul to be subdued and subject! What great riches it is to be poor! What a mighty honor to be despised! What a height it is to be beaten down! What a comfort it is to be afflicted! What a credit of knowledge it is to be reputed ignorant! And finally, what a happiness of happiness it is to be crucified with Christ! Is this the lot which the apostle gloried in? Let others boast in their riches, dignities, delights, and honors. But to us there is no higher honor than to be denied, despised, and crucified with Christ. But what a grief this is, that scarce is there one soul which despises spiritual pleasures, and is willing to be denied for Christ, embracing His cross with love. Many are they who are called to perfection, but few are they that arrive at it, because they are few who embrace the cross with patience, constancy, peace, and resignation. To deny one's self in all things is to be subject to another's judgment, to mortify continually all inward passions, to annihilate one's self in all respects, to follow always that which is contrary to one's own will, appetite, and judgment, are things that few can do. Many are those that teach them, but few are they that practice them. Many souls have undertaken, and daily do undertake this way, and they persevere all the while. They keep the sweet relish of their primitive fervor, but this sweetness and sensible delight is scarcely done, but presently upon the overtaking of a storm of trouble, temptation, and dryness, which are necessary things to help a man up the high mountain of perfection, they falter and turn back. A clear sign that they sought themselves, and not God or perfection. May it please God that the souls which have had light and been called to an inward peace, and by not being constant in dryness and tribulation and temptation, have started back, may not be cast into outer darkness, with him that had not been on him a wedding garment, although he was a servant, for not being disposed, giving himself up to self-love. This monster must be vanquished. This seven-headed beast of self-love must be beheaded. In order to get up to the top of the high mountain of peace, this monster put his head everywhere. Sometimes it gets amongst relations, which strangely hinder with their conversation, to which nature easily lets itself be led. Sometimes it gets a good look of gratitude into passionate affection, and without restraint towards the confessor. Sometimes into affection to most subtle spiritual vainglories and temporal ones, niceties of honor, things which stick very close. Sometimes it cleaves to spiritual pleasures, staying even in the gifts of God and his graces freely bestowed. Sometimes it desires exceedingly the preservation of health, and with disguise to be used well, and its own proper profit. Sometimes it would seem well with very curious subtleties, and lastly, it cleaves with a notable propensity to its own proper judgment and opinion in all things, the roots of which are closely fixed in its own will. All these are effects of self-love, and if they be not denied, impossible that a man should ever get up to the height of perfect contemplation, to the highest happiness of the loving union and the lofty throne of peace eternal. Chapter 4. Of the two spiritual martyrdoms wherewith God cleanseth the soul that he unites with himself. Now you shall know that God uses two ways for the cleansing of the souls which he would perfect and enlighten, to unite them closely to himself. The first, of which we will treat in this and the following chapter, is with the bitter waters of afflictions, anguish, distress, and inward torments. The second is with the burning fire of an inflamed love, a love impatient and hungry. Sometimes he makes use of both in these souls which he would fill with perfection. Sometimes he puts them into the strong steeping of tribulations, in inward and outward bitterness, scorching them with the fire of rigorous temptation. Sometimes he puts them into the crucible of anxious and distrustful love, making them fast there with a mighty force, because so much of the greater as the Lord would have the illumination and union of a soul to be, so much more strong is the torment and the purgation, because all the knowledge and union with God arises from suffering, which is the truest proof of love. Oh, that thou wouldst understand the greater good of tribulation. This is that which blots out sins, cleanses the soul, and produces patience. This in prayer inflames it, enlarges it, and puts it upon the exercise of the most sublime act of charity. This rejoices the soul, brings it near to God, calls it to and gives it entrance into heaven. The same is that which tries the true servants of God, and renders them sweet, valiant, and constant. That it is which makes God hear them with speed. 'Tis that which annihilates, refines, and perfects them. And finally, this is that which of earthly makes souls heavenly, of humane, divine, transforming them and uniting them in an admirable manner with the Lord's humanity and divinity. It was well said by Saint Augustine that the life of the soul upon earth is temptation. Blessed is the soul which is always opposed, if it doth constantly resist temptation. This is the means which the Lord makes use of to humble it, to annihilate it, to spend it, to mortify it, to deny it, to perfect it, to fill it with this divine gifts. By this means of tribulation and temptation he comes down to earth, to transform it and crown it. persuade thyself that the temptations and fightings are necessary for the soul to make it perfect. O blessed soul, if thou knowest how to be constant and quiet in the fire of tribulation, and wouldst but let thyself be washed with the bitter waters of affliction, how quickly wouldst thou find thyself rich in heavenly gifts? How soon would the divine bounty make a rich throne in thyself, and a goodly habitation for thee to refresh and solace thyself in? Know that this Lord hath his repose nowhere but in quiet souls, and in those which the fire of tribulation and temptation hath burnt up the dregs of passion, and the bitter waters of afflictions, hath washed off the filthy spots of inordinate appetites. In a word, this Lord reposes not himself anywhere but where quietness reigns, and self-love is banished. But thou wilt never arrive at this happy state, nor find in thy soul the precious pledge of peace eternal. Although thou hast gotten the better of the external senses by the grace of God, till it become purified from the disordered passions of concupiscence, self-esteem, desire, and thoughts, how spiritual soever, and many other interests and secret vices, which lie within the very soul of thee, miserably hindering the peaceable entrance of that great Lord into it, who would be united and transformed with thee. The very virtues acquired and not purified are a hindrance to this great gift of the peace of the soul. And more, the soul is clogged by an inordinate desire of sublime gifts, by the appetite of feeling, of spiritual consolation, by sticking to infused and divine graces, entertaining itself in them, and desiring more of them, to enjoy them, and finally, by a desire of benign great. Oh, how much is there to be purified in a soul that must arrive at the holy mountain of perfection, and of transformation with God! Oh, how disposed, naked, denied, annihilated ought the soul to be which would not hinder the entrance of this divine Lord into it, nor to his continual communication. This disposition of preparing the soul in its bottom for a divine entrance must of necessity be made by the divine wisdom. If a seraphim is not sufficient to purify the soul, how shall a soul that is frail, miserable, and without experience ever be able to purify itself? Therefore, the Lord himself will dispose thee and prepare thee passively by a way thou understandest not, with the fire of tribulation and of inward torment, without any other disposition on thy side than a consent to the internal and external cross. Thou wilt find within thyself a passive dryness, a darkness, and anguish, contradictions, continual resistance, inward desertions, horrible desolations, continual and strong suggestions, and vehement temptations of the enemy. Finally, thou wilt see thyself so afflicted that thou wilt not be able to lift up thy heart, being full of sorrow and heaviness, nor do the least act of faith, hope, or charity. Here thou wilt see thyself forlorn and subject to passions of impatience, rage, anger, swearing, disordered appetites, seeming to thyself the most miserable creature, the greatest sinner in the world, the most abhorred of God, deprived and stripped of all virtue with a pain like that of hell, seeing thyself afflicted and desolate, to think that thou hast altogether lost God. This will be thy cruel cutting and most bitter torment. But though thou shalt see thyself so oppressed, seeming to thyself to be proud, impatient, and wrathful, yet these temptations shall lose their force and a power upon thee. They shall have no place in thy soul by a secret virtue, the sovereign gift of inward strength, which rules in the inmost part of it, conquering the most affrightening punishment and pain, and the strongest temptation. Keep constant, O blessed soul, keep constant, for it will not be as thou imaginest, nor art thou at any time nearer to God than in such cases of desertion. For although the sun is hid in the clouds, yet it changes not its place, nor a jot the more loses its brightness. The Lord permits that this painful desertion in thy soul to purge and polish thee, to cleanse thee and disrobe thee of thyself, that thou mayst in this manner be all his, and give thyself wholly up to him as his infinite bounty is entirely given to thee, that thou mayst be his delight. For although thou dost groan and lament and weep, yet he is joyful and glad in the most secret and hidden place of thy soul. Chapter 5. How important and necessary it is to the interior soul to suffer blindfold this first and spiritual martyrdom, to the end that the soul of earthly may become heavenly, and may become to that of the greatest good of union with God. It is necessary for it to be purified in the fire of tribulation and temptation. And although it be true, a known and approved maxim, that all those that serve the Lord must suffer troubles, persecutions, and tribulations, yet the happy souls which are guided by God, by the secret way of the interior walk and of purgative contemplation, must suffer above all strong and horrible temptations and torments, more bitter than those wherewith the martyrs were crowned in the primitive church. The martyrs, besides the shortness of their torment, which hardly endured days, were comforted with a clear light and special help, in hope of the near and sure rewards. But the desolate soul that must die in itself, and be put off, and make clean its heart, seeing itself abandoned by God, surrounded by temptations, darkness, anguish, affliction, sorrows, and rigid doubts, doth taste of death every moment in its painful torment and tremendous desolation, without feeling the least comfort, with an affliction so great that the pain of it seems nothing else but a death prolonged, a continual martyrdom, where with great reason it may be said that although there be many martyrs, yet there are few souls which follow Christ our Lord with peace and resignation in such torments. Then it was men that martyred them, and God comforted their souls, but now it is God that afflicts and hides himself, and the devils, like cruel executioners, have 1,000 ways to torment the soul and the body, the whole man being crucified within and without. Thy sorrows will seem to thee to be insuperable, and thy afflictions past the power of comfort, and that heaven reigns no more upon thee. Thou wilt feel thyself begirt with griefs, and besieged with sorrows eternal. From the darkness of thy powers, from the weakness of discourse, strong temptations will afflict thee. Painful distrusts and troublesome scruples, nay, light and judgment will forsake thee. All the creatures will give thee trouble. Spiritual counsels will bring thee pain. The reading of books, howsoever holy, will not comfort thee as it used to do. If they speak to thee of patience, they will exceedingly trouble thee. The fear of losing God through thy thankfulness and want of returns will torment thee to the soul. If thou groanest and beggest help of God, thou wilt find, instead of comfort, an inward reproof and disfavor, like another Canaanite woman to whom he made no answer at first, and then treated her as the creature he was speaking of. And although at this time the Lord will not abandon thee, because it would be impossible to live one moment without his help, yet the succor will be so secret that thy soul will not know it, nor be capable of hope and of consolation. Nay, it will seem to be without remedy, suffering like a condemned person the pains of hell, and it would change them as such with a violent death, which would be of great comfort, but like those at the end of afflictions and bitterness, will seem impossible. But if thou, O blessed soul, shouldst know how much thou art beloved and defended by that divine Lord in the midst of thy living torments, thou wouldst seem to find them so sweet that it would be necessary that God should work a miracle to let thee live. Be constant, O happy soul, be constant and of good courage, for however intolerable thou art to thyself, yet thou wilt be protected, enriched and beloved by that greatest good, as if he had nothing else to do than to lead thee to perfection, by the highest steps of love. And if thou dost not turn away, but perseverest constantly, without leaving off thy undertaking, know that thou offerest to God the most accepted sacrifice, so that if this Lord were capable of pain, he would find no ease till he has completed this loving union with thy soul. If from the chaos of nothing his omnipotence has produced so many wonders, what will he do in thy soul, created after his own image and likeness, if thou keepest constant, quiet, happy, and resigned, with a true knowledge of thy nothing? Happy soul, which, even when 'tis disturbed, afflicted, and disconsolate, keeps ready there within, without going forth to declare exterior comfort. Afflict not thyself too much, and with inquietude, because these sharp martyrdoms may continue. Persevere in humility, and go out of thyself to seek aid. For all the good consists in being silent, suffering, and holding patience with rest and resignation. There will find thou the divine strength to overcome so hard a warfare. He is within thee that fightest for thee. He is strength itself. When thou come to this painful state of fearful desolation, weeping and lamenting are not forbidden thy soul. Whilst in the upper part of it keeps resigned, who can bear the Lord's heavy hand without tears and lamentation? The great champion Job, even he lamented. So did Christ our Lord in his forsakings, but their weepings were accompanied with resignation. Afflict not thyself, though God do crucify thee, and make trial of thy fidelity. Imitate the woman of Canaan, who, being rejected and injured, did importune and persevere, humbling herself and following him, though she were treated as she was. It is necessary to drink the cup and to not go back. If the scales were taken from thine eyes, as they were from St. Paul's, thou wouldst see the necessity of suffering and glory as he did, esteeming the more being crucified than being an apostle. Thy good luck consists not in enjoining, but suffering with quiet and resignation. Saint Teresa appeared after her death to a certain soul and told it that she had only been rewarded for her pain, and had not received 1 dram of reward for so many ecstasies and revelations and comforts that she had enjoyed here in this world. Although this painful martyrdom of horrible desolation and passive purgation be so tremendous, that with reason it hath gotten the name of hell amongst divine mystics, because it seems impossible to be able to live a moment with so grievous a torment, so great a reason it may be said that he suffers it, lives dying, and dying lives a lingering death. Yet know that it is necessary to endure it, to arrive at the sweet, joyous, and abundant riches of high contemplation and loving union. There has been no soul which has not passed through this spiritual martyrdom and painful torment. St. Gregory the Pope in the last 2 months of his life, St. Francis of Assisi 2.5 years, St. Mary Magdalene of Pazzi 5 years, St. Rose of Peru 15 years. And after such miracles as he made the world amazed, St. Dominic suffered it till even half an hour of his happy exit. Chapter 6 of Divine Love. The other more profitable and meritorious martyrdom in souls already advanced in perfection and deep contemplation is a fire of divine love, which burns the soul and makes it painful with the same love. Sometimes the absence of its beloved afflicts it. Sometimes the sweet, ardent, and welcome weight of the loving and divine presence torments it. This sweet martyrdom always makes it sigh, sometimes if it enjoys and has its beloved, for the pleasure of having him, so that it cannot contain itself other times if he does not manifest himself, through the ardent anxiety on finding and enjoying him. All this is painting, suffering, and dying for love. All that thou couldst but become to conceive the contrariety of accidents that an enamoured soul suffers. The combat so terrible and strong on one side, so sweet and melting and amiable on the other. The martyrdom so piercing and sharp, which love torments it, and the cross so painful and sweet withal, without ever being in the mind of getting free from it whilst thou lives. Just so much as light and love increases, just so much increases the grief in seeing that good absent, which it loves so well. To feel it near itself is enjoyment, and to never have done knowing and possessing it consumes its life. It has food and drink near its mouth, whilst it wants either and cannot be satisfied. It sees itself swallowed up and drowned in a sea of love, whilst the powerful hand that is to save it is near it, and yet doth not do it, nor doth it know when he will come, who it is so much as desires. Sometimes it hears the inward voice of its beloved, which calls and courts it from a soft and delicate whisper, which goes forth from the secret of the soul where it abides, which pierces it strongly, even to melt and dissolve it, in seeing how near it hath come within himself, and yet how far off from it, whilst it cannot come to possess him. This intoxicates it, embases it, scares it, and fills it with an unsatisfiableness, and therefore love is said to be as strong as death, whilst it kills just as that doth. Chapter 7. Inward mortification and perfect resignation are necessary for obtaining internal peace. The most subtle arrow that is shot at us from nature is to induce us to that which is unlawful with a pretense. That is maybe necessary and useful. Oh, how many souls have suffered themselves to be led away, and have lost the spirit by this gilded cheat. Thou wilt never taste the delicious manna, unless thou dost perfectly overcome thyself, even to die in thyself, because he who endeavours not to die to his passions is not well disposed to receive the gift of understanding, without the infusion whereof it is impossible for him to go into himself and be changed in his spirit. Therefore, those that keep without having anything of nothing of it. Never disquiet thyself for any accident, for inquietude is the door by which the enemy gets into the soul to rob it of its peace. Resign and deny thyself wholly, for though true self-denial is harsh at the beginning, 'tis easy in the middle and becomes most sweet in the end. Thou wilt find thyself far from perfection, if thou dost not find everything in God. Know that pure, perfect, and essential love consists in the cross, in self-denial and resignation, in perfect humility, in poverty of spirit, and in a mean opinion of thyself. In the time of strong temptation, desertion, and desolation, 'tis necessary for thee to get close into thy centre, that thou mayst only look at and contemplate God, who keeps his throne and his abode in the bottom of thy soul. Thou wilt find impatience, and bitterness of heart to grow from the depth of sensible, empty, and mortified love. True love is known, with its effects when the soul is profoundly humbled and desires to be truly mortified and despised. Many there be who, however they have been dedicated to prayer, yet have no relish of God, because in the end of their prayers they are neither mortified, nor attend upon God any longer. For obtaining that peaceable and continual attending, 'tis necessary to get a great purity of mind and of heart, great peace of soul, and a universal resignation. To the simple and the mortified, the recreation of the senses is a sort of death. They never go to it, unless compelled by necessity and edification of their neighbors. The bottom of our soul, you will know, is the place of our happiness. There the Lord shews us wonders. There we engulf and lose ourselves in the immeasurable ocean of his infinite goodness, which we keep fixed and immovable. There resides the incomparable fruition of our soul and that eminent and sweet rest of it. A humble and resigned soul, which has come to this bottom, seeks no more than to merely please God, and the holy and loving Spirit teaches it everything with his sweet and enlivening unction. Amongst the saints, there are some gigantic ones, who continually suffer with patience indispositions of body, of which God takes the great care. But high and sovereign is their gift, who by the strength of the Holy Ghost suffer both internal and external crosses with content and resignation. This is that sort of holiness, so much more rare as it is more precious in the sight of God. The spiritual ones which walk this way are rare, because there are few in this world who do totally deny themselves, to follow Christ crucified, with simple awareness and bareness of spirit, through the lonesome and thorny ways of the cross, without making reflections upon themselves. A life of self-denial is, above all, miracles of the saints. It doth not know whether it be alive or dead, lost or gained, whether it agrees or resists. This is the true resigned life. But although it should be a long time before thou comes to this state, and thou shouldst not think to have one made step towards it, yet affright not thyself at this. For God uses to bestow upon a soul that blessing in one moment, which was denied for it for many years before. He has desires to suffer blindfold without the comfort of God or the creatures, is gotten too far onwards to be able to resist unjust accusations, which his enemies make against him, even in the most dreadful and interior desolation. The spiritual man that lives by God and in him is inwardly contented in the midst of his adversities, because the cross and affliction are his life and delight. Tribulation is a great treasure, wherewith God honors those that be his in this life. Therefore evil men are necessary for those that are good. And so are the devils themselves, which by afflicting us do try to ruin us. But instead of doing us harm, they do us the greatest good imaginable. There must be tribulation to make a man's life acceptable to God. Without it, 'tis like the body without the soul without grace, and the earth without the sun. With the wind of tribulation, God separates in the floor of the soul the chaff from the corn. When God crucifies in the innermost part of the soul, no creature is able to comfort it. Nay, comforts are but grievous and bitter crosses to it, and if it be well instructed in the laws and discipline of the ways of pure love, in the time of great desolation and inward troubles, it ought not to seek abroad amongst the creatures of comfort, nor lament itself with them, nor will it be able to read spiritual books, because this is a secret way of getting at a distance from suffering. Those souls are to be pitied who cannot find in their hearts to believe that tribulation and suffering is their greatest blessing. They who are perfect ought always to be desirous of dying and suffering. because always in a state of death and suffering, vain is the man who doth not suffer. Because he is born to toil and suffering, but much more the friends and elect of God. Undeceive thyself, and believe, that in order to thy soul's being totally transformed with God, it is necessary for it to be lost and denied in its sense, knowledge and power, and to die living and not living, dying and not dying, suffering and not suffering, resigning up and not resigning up itself without reflecting upon anything. Perfection in its followers receives not glories but by fire and martyrdom, griefs, torments, punishments, and contempt, suffered and endured with gallantry and courage, and he that would go have some place to set his feet on and rest himself, does not go beyond the reason and of sense, will never get into the secret cabinet of knowledge, though by reading he may get a chance to have taste and relish the understanding of it. Chapter 8. You must know that the Lord will not manifest himself in thy soul, till it be denied in itself, and dead in its senses and powers, nor will it be ever come unto this state, till being perfectly resigned, it resolves to be with God all alone, making an equal account of gifts and of contempt, light and darkness, peace and war, in sum that the soul may arrive at perfect quietness and supreme internal peace. It ought first to die in itself, and live only in God and for him. The more dead it shall be in itself, the more it shall know God. But if doth not know mind at this continual denying of itself and internal mortification, it will never arrive at this state, nor preserve God within it. Then it will be continually subject to accidents and passions of the mind. Such are judging, murmuring, resenting, excusing, defending, to keep its honor and reputation, which are enemies to perfection, peace, and the spirit. Know that the diversity of stakes amongst those that be spiritual consists only in dying all alike, but in the happy which die continually, God hath his honor, his blessing and delights here below. Great is the difference which is between doing, suffering, and dying. Doing is delightful and belongs to beginners. Suffering with desire belongs to those who are proficients. Dying always in themselves belongs to those who are accomplished and perfect, of which there are very few in the world. How happy wilt thou be, if thou hast no other thought but to die in thyself? Thou wilt then become not only victorious over thine enemies, but also over thyself, in which victory thou wilt certainly find pure love, perfect peace, and divine wisdom. It is impossible for a man to be able to think and live mystically in a simple understanding of the divine and infused wisdom, if he does not first die in himself by the total denying of sense and the reasonable appetite. The true lesson of the spiritual man, and that which thou oughtest to learn, is to leave all things in their place, and not meddle with any. But what thy office they may bind thee to, because the soul which leaves everything to find God, doth then begin to have all the eternity it seeks. Some souls there are who seek repose. Others without seeking have in the pleasure of it. Others have a pleasure in pain, and others seek it. The first do as good as nothing, the second are in the way towards it, the third run, and the last fly. The disesteem of delights and the counting of them torment is the property of a truly mortified man. Enjoyment and internal peace are the fruits of the Spirit divine, and no man gets them into his possession, if in the closet of his soul he is not a resigned man. Thou seest that displeasures of the good pass presently away. But for all that endeavour never to have them, nor to stop them, for they are damned thy health, disturb thy reason, and disquiet thy spirit. amongst other holy counsels, which thou must observe, remember that this follows. Look not upon other men's faults, but keep thine own. Keep silence with a continued internal conversation. Mortify thyself in all things and at all hours, and by this means thou wilt get free from many imperfections. Make thyself commander of great virtues. Mortify thyself in not judging ill of any body at any time, because the suspicion of thy neighbor disturbs the purity of heart, discomposes it, brings the soul out, and takes away its repose. Never wilt thou have perfect resignation if thou mindst human respects and reflects upon the little idol of what people say. The soul that goes by the inward way will soon lose itself, if once it came to look at reason amongst the creatures, and in commerce and conversation with them. There is no other reason than to not look at reason, but to imagine that God permits grievances to fall on us, to humble and annihilate us, to make us live wholly resigned. Behold now how God makes greater account of a soul that lives internally resigned than of another that doth miracles, even to the raising of the dead. Many souls there are, which though they exercise prayer, because they are not mortified, are always imperfect and full of self-love. Hold it for a true maxim that no body can do a grievance or injury to a soul despised by itself, and that one is nothing in its own account. Finally, be of hope, suffer, be silent and patient. Let nothing affright thee. All of it will have a time to end. Only God is he that is unchangeable. Patience brings a man in everything. He that hath God hath all things, and he that hath him not hath nothing. Chapter 9. For the obtaining of internal peace, 'tis necessary for the soul to know its misery. If the soul should not fall into some faults, it would never come to understand its own misery. Though it hears men speak and reads spiritual books, nor can it ever obtain precious peace, if it do not first know its own miserable weakness, because there the remedy is difficult, where there is no clear knowledge of the defect. God will suffer in thee sometimes one fault, sometimes another, that by this knowledge of thyself, seeing thee so often fallen, thou mayst believe that thou art a mere nothing, in which knowledge and belief true peace and perfect humility is founded. That thou mayst the better search into the mysteries, and see what thou art, I will try to undeceive thee in some of thy manifold imperfections. Thou art so quick and nice, that it may be if thou dost but trip as thou walkest or findest thy way molested, thou feelst even hell in thyself. If thou art denied by thy due or thy pleasure opposed, thou presently brisk it up with a warm resentment of it. If thou spiest a fault in thy neighbor, instead of pitying him and thinking that thou art self-liable to the same failing, thou indiscreetly reprovest him. If thou seest a thing convenient for thee and canst compass it, thou growest sad and full of sorrow. If thou received a slight injury from thy neighbor, thou chidest him and complainest for it, insomuch that for any trifle thou art inwardly and outwardly discomposed and loseth thyself. Thou wouldst still be penitent, but with another's patience, and if the impatience still continues, thou layest the fault with much pains upon thy companion, without considering that thou art intolerable to thyself. And when the rancor is over, thou cunningly dost return to make thyself virtuous, giving documents and relating spiritual sayings with artifice of wit, without mending thy past faults. Although thou willingly dost condemn thyself, reproving thy faults before others, yet this thou dost more to justify thyself with him than seize thy faults, that thou mayst return again afresh to the former esteem of thyself, than through any effect of perfect humility. Other times thou dost subtly allege that it is not through fault but of zeal of justice that thou complainest of thy neighbor. Thou believest for the most part that thou art virtuous, constant, and courageous, even to the giving up of thy life into the tyrant's hand, solely for the sake of divine love. Yet thou canst scarce hear the least word of anger, but presently thou dost afflict and trouble and disquiet thyself. These are all industrious engines of self-love, and the secret pride of thy soul. Know therefore that self-love reigns in thee, and that from purchasing this precious peace, that it is thy greatest hindrance. Chapter 10, in which is shewed and discovered what is the false humility, and what the true with the effects of them. Thou must know that there are two sorts of humility, one false and counterfeit, the other true. The false one is theirs, who, like water which must mount upwards, receive an external fall and artificial submission, to rise up again immediately. These avoid esteem and honor, so that they may be took to be humble. They say of themselves that they are very evil, that they many be thought good, and though they know their own misery, yet they are loath that other folks should know it. This is dissembled humility and feigned, but nothing more than secret pride. Theirs is the true humility, which have gotten a perfect habit of it. These never think of it, but judge humbly of themselves. They do things with courage and patience. They live and die in God. They mind not themselves nor the creatures. They are inconstant and quiet in all things. They suffer molestation with joy, desiring more of it, that they may imitate their dear and despised Jesus. They covet to be reputed trifles and sport by the world. They are contented with what God allots them, and are convinced of their faults with a pleasing shame. They are not humbled by the counsel of reason, but by the affection of the will. There is no honor that they look after, nor injury to disturb them, no trouble to vex them, no prosperity to make them proud, because they are always immovable in their nothing, and in themselves with absolute peace. And that thou mayst be acquainted with interior and true humility, know that doth not consist in external acts, in taking the lowest place, in going poor in clothes, in speaking submissively, in shutting the eyes, in affectionate sighing, nor in condemning thy ways, calling thyself miserable, to give others to understand that thou art humble. It consists only in the contempt of thyself, and the desire to be despised, with a low and profound knowledge, without concerning thyself, whether thou art esteemed humble or no, through an angel should reveal such a thing to thee. The torrent of light wherewith the Lord with his graces enlightens the soul doth two things. It discovers the greatness of God, and at the same time the soul knows its own stench and misery, insomuch that no tongue is able to express the depth in which it is overwhelmed, being desirous that every one should know its humility, and 'tis so far from vain glory and complacency, as it sees that the grace of God to be the mere goodness of him, and nothing but his mercy, which is pleased to take pity on it. Thou shalt never be hurt by men or by devils, but by thyself, thy own proper pride, and the violence of thy passions. Take heed of thyself, for thou of thyself art the greatest devil of all to thyself. Have no mind to be esteemed when God incarnate was called fool, drunkard, and said to have a devil. Oh, the folly of Christians, that we should be willing to enjoy happiness without being willing to imitate him on the cross, in reproaches, humility, poverty, and in other virtues. The truly humble man is at rest and ease in his heart. There he stands the trial of God and men and the devil himself, above all reason and discretion, possessing himself in peace and quietness, looking for with all humility the pure pleasure of God, as well as in life and death, Things without do no more disquiet him, than if they never were. The cross to him and even death itself are delights, though he make no such shew outwardly. But oh, who do we speak of? For few there are of these sorts of humble men in the world. Hope thou and desire, and suffer and die without any body's knowing it, for herein consists the humble and perfect love. Oh, how much peace wilt thou find in thy soul if thou dost profoundly humble thyself, and even hug contempt. Thou wilt never be perfectly humble, though thou knowest thy own misery, unless thou desirest that all men should know it. Then thou wilt avoid praises, embrace injuries, despise everything that makes a fair shew, even to thine own self, and if any tribulation come upon thee, blame none for it, but judge that it comes from God's hand as the giver of every good. If thou wouldst bear thy neighbour's faults, cast thine eyes upon thine own, and if thou thinkest to thyself that thou hast made any progress in perfection by thyself, know that thou art not humble at all, nor hast made one step in the way of the Spirit. The degrees of humility are the qualities of a body in the grave. That is, to be in the lowest place, buried like one that's dead to stink and to be corrupted to itself, to be dust and nothing in one's own account. Finally, if thou wouldst be blessed, learn to despise thyself and to be despised by others. Chapter 11. Maxims to know a simple, humble, and true heart. Encourage thyself to be humble, embracing tribulations as instruments of thy good. Rejoice in contempt, and desire that God may be thy only refuge, comfort, and protector. None, let him be never so great in this world, can be greater than he that is in the eye and favour of God. And therefore the truly humble man despises whatever there is in the world, even to himself, and puts his only trust and repose in God. The truly humble man suffers quietly and patiently internal troubles, and he is the man that makes great way in little time, like one that sails before the wind. The truly humble man finds God in all things, so that whatever contempt, injury, or affront comes to him by means of creatures, he receives it with the great peace and internal quiet. As sent from the divine hand, and loves greatly the instrument with which the Lord tries him. He is not yet arrived at profound humility that is taken with praise, though he does not desire it nor seek it, but rather avoids it, because a humble heart praises are bitter crosses, although it be wholly quiet and immovable. He has no internal humility who doth not abhor himself with a mortal, but with all a peaceable and quiet hatred. He will never come to possess this treasure, that has now not a low and profound knowledge of his own vileness, rottenness, and misery. He that is upon excuses and replies has not a simple and humble heart, especially if he does this with his superiors, because replies grow from a secret pride that reigns within the soul, and hence the total ruin of it. Perfidiousness supposes little submission, and this less humility, and both together they are the fuel of inquietude, discord, and disturbance. The humble heart is not disquieted by imperfections, though these do grieve it to the soul, because they are against its loving Lord, nor is he concerned that he cannot do great things, for he always stands in his own nothing and misery. Nay, he wonders at himself, that he can do anything of virtue, and presently thanks the Lord for it with a true knowledge that it is God that doth all, and remains dissatisfied with what he himself does. The truly humble man, though he sees all, yet he looks upon nothing to judge it, because he judge ill only of himself. The truly humble man doth always find an excuse to defend him that mortifies him, at least a sound intention. Who, therefore, would be angry with a man of good intention? To say, nay more, doth false humility displease God, as true pride does, because that is hypocrisy besides. The truly humble man, although everything falls out contrary to him, is neither disquieted nor afflicted at it, because he is prepared, and he thinks he deserves no less. He is not disquieted under troublesome thoughts, wherewith the devil seeks to torment him, nor under temptations, tribulations, and desertions, but rather acknowledges his unworthiness, and is affected that the Lord chastises him by the devil's means. Though he be a vile instrument, all he suffers seems nothing to him, and he never doth a thing that he thinks worth any great matter. He that is arrived at perfect and inward humility, although he be disturbed at nothing, as one that pours himself, because he knows his imperfection in every thing, his ingratitude and his misery, yet he suffers a great cross in enduring himself. This is the sign to know true humility of heart by. But the happy soul, which is gotten to this holy hatred of itself, lives overwhelmed, drowned, and swallowed up in the depths of its own divine nothing, out of which the Lord raises him by communicating divine wisdom to him, and filling him with light, peace, tranquility, and love. Inward solitude is that which chiefly brings a man to the purchase of internal peace. Know that although exterior solitude doth much assist for the obtaining of internal peace, yet the Lord did not mean this when he spake to his prophet, I will bring her into solitude and speak privately to her. But he meant the interior solitude, which jointly conduces to the obtaining of the precious jewel of peace internal. Internal solitude consists in the forgetting of all these creatures, in disengaging oneself from them, in a perfect nakedness of all the affections, desires, thoughts, and one's own will. This is the true solitude where the soul reposes with a sweet and inward serenity in the arms of its chiefest good. Oh, what infinite room is there in a soul that is arrived at this divine solitude! Oh, what inward, what retired, what secret, what spacious, what vast distances are there within a happy soul that is once come to be truly solitary! There the Lord converses and communicates himself inwardly with the soul. There he fills it with himself, because it is empty, clothes it with light and with his love. Because it is naked, it lifts it up, because 'tis low, and unites it with himself, and transforms it because it is alone. O delightful solitude, and gifter of eternal blessings! O mirror in which the eternal Father is always beheld! There is great reason to call thee solitude, for thou art so much alone that there is scarce a soul that looks after thee, that loves and knows thee. O divine Lord, how is it that souls do not go from earth to this glory? How come they lose so great a good, though the only love and desire of created things? Blessed soul, how happy wilt thou be if thou dost but leave for all God. Seek him only, and breathe after none but him. Let him only have thy sighs. Desire nothing, and then nothing can trouble thee. If thou dost any desire any good, how spiritual soever it be, let it be in such a manner, that thou mayst not be disquieted if thou missest it. If with this liberty thou wilt give thy soul to God, taken off from the world, free and alone, thou wilt be the happiest creature upon earth. because the Most High in his secret habitation in this holy solitude, in this desert and paradise, is enjoyed the conversation of God. It is only in this internal retirement that marvelous, powerful, and divine voice is heard. If thou wouldst enter into this heaven of earth, forget every care and every thought. Get out of thyself, that the love of God may live in thy soul. Live as much as ever thou canst, abstracted from the creatures. Dedicate thyself wholly to thy Creator, and offer thyself in sacrifice with peace and quietness of spirit. Know that the more the soul disrobes itself, the more it makes way into this interior solitude and becomes clothed with God. The more lonesome and empty of itself the soul gets to be, the more the divine spirit fills it. There is not a more blessed life than a solitary one. Because in this happy life, God gives himself all to the creature, and to the creature all to God by an intimate and sweet union of love. Oh, how few there are that come to relish this true solitude. To make the soul truly solitary, it ought to forget all the creatures and even itself. Otherwise it will never be able to make any approach near to God. Many men leave and forsake all things, but they do not leave their own liking, their own will, and themselves. And therefore these truly solitary ones are so few, wherefore if the soul does not get off from its own appetite and desire, from its own will, from spiritual gifts, and from repose, even in the spirit itself, it can never arrive at this high felicity of internal solitude. Go on, blessed soul. Go on without stop towards this blessedness of internal solitude. See how God calls thee to enter into thy inward center, where he will renew thee, change thee, fill thee, clothe thee, and shew thee a new and heavenly kingdom, full of joy, peace, content, and serenity. Chapter 13, in which is shewed and what infused and passive contemplation is, and its wonderful effects. You must know that when once the soul is habituated to internal recollection and acquired contemplation that we have spoken of, when once 'tis mortified and desires wholly to be denied its apprentices, and when once it is effaciously embraces internal and external mortification, and is willing to die heartily to its passion and its own ways, then God uses it to take it alone by itself, and raise it more than when it knows to a complete repose, where he sweetly and inwardly infuses it in his light, his love, and his strength, enkindling and inflaming it with a true disposition to all manner of virtue. There the divine spouse, suspending its powers, puts it to sleep in a most sweet and pleasant rest. There it sleeps and quietly receives and enjoys, without knowing it, what it enjoys, with a most lovely and charming calm. There the soul, raised up and lifted to this passive state, becomes united to its greatest union, without costing it any trouble or pains for this union. There in that supreme region and sacred temple of the soul, that greatest good takes its complacency, manifests itself, and creates a relish from the creature in a way above sense and all humane understanding. There also only the pure spirit who is God, the purity of the soul being incapable of sensible things, rules it, and gets the mastery of it, communicating to its illustrations and to those sentiments which are necessary for the most pure and perfect union. The soul, coming to itself again from these sweet and divine embracings, becomes rich in light and love, and a mighty esteem of the divine greatness and the knowledge of its own misery, finding itself perfectly changed, divinely, and disposed to embrace, to suffer, and to practice perfect virtue. A simple, pure, and infused spirit of perfect contemplation, therefore is a known and inward manifestation which God gives of himself, of his goodness, of his peace, of his sweetness, whose object is God, pure, unspeakable, abstracted from all particular thoughts, within an inward silence. But it is God delights us, God that draws us, God that sweetly raises us in a spiritual and pure manner, and admirable gift which the divine majesty bestows to whom he will, as he will, and when he will, and for what time he will, though the state of his life be rather a state of the cross of patience, of humility and of suffering, than of enjoying. Never wilt thou enjoy this divine nectar, till thou art advanced in virtue and in inward mortification, till thou dost heartily endeavor to fix in thy soul a great peace, silence, forgetfulness, and internal solitude. How is it possible to hear the sweet, inward, and powerful voice of God in the midst of the noise and tumult of the creatures? How can the pure spirit be heard in the midst of considerations and discourses of artifice? If the soul will not continually die in itself, dying itself to all these materialities and satisfactions, the contemplation can be no more but a mere vanity, a vain complacency and presumption. Chapter 14. God doth not always communicate himself with equal abundance in this sweetest and infused contemplation. Sometimes he grants this grace more than he doth at other times, and sometimes he expects not that the soul should be so dead and denied, because this gift being his mere grace, he gives it when he pleases, and as he pleases, so that no general rule can be made of it, nor any rate set to his divine greatness. Nay, by means of this very contemplation he comes to deny it, and to annihilate, and die. Sometimes the Lord gives greater light to the understanding, sometimes greater love to the will. There is no need here for the soul to take any pains or trouble. It must receive what God gives it, and rest united as he will have it. Because his majesty is Lord, and in the very time that he lays it asleep, he possesses and fills it, and works in it powerfully and sweetly, without any industry or knowledge of its own, insomuch that before ever it is aware of this so great a mercy, it is gained, convinced, and changed happily. The soul which is in this happy state hath two things to avoid: the activity of human spirit and interestedness. Our humane spirit is willing to die in itself, but loveth to be doing and discoursing after its way, being in love with its own actions. A man has need to have a great fidelity, divesting himself of selfishness, to get a perfect and passive capacity of the divine influences. The continual habits of operating freely which it has are a hindrance to its annihilation. The second is interestedness in contemplation itself. Thou must therefore procure in thy soul a perfect divesting of all which is not God, without seeking any other end or interest within or without but the divine will. In a word, the manner that thou must use on thy part to fit thyself for this pure, passive, and perfect prayer is a total and absolute consignment of thyself, with a perfect submission to his most holy will, to be busied according to his pleasure and disposition, with a perfect resignation. Thou must know that few be the souls which arrive at this infused and passive prayer, because few of them are capable of these divine influences with a total nakedness and death of their own. Those only which feel it, know it so, that this perfect nakedness is acquired by the help of God's grace and by a continual and inward mortification, dying to all its own inclinations and desires. At no time must thou look at the effects which are wrought in thy soul, but especially herein because it would be a hindrance to the divine operations which enrich it. To do so, all thou hast to do is pant after indifference, resignation, forgetfulness, and without thy being sensible of it, the greatest good will leave in thy soul a fit disposition for the practice of virtue, a true love of the cross of thy own contempt, of thy annihilation, of greater and stronger desires still of thy greater perfection, and the most pure and effective union. Chapter 15. Of the two means whereby the soul ascends up to infused contemplation, with the explication of what and how many steps of it are. The means whereby the soul ascends to the felicity of contemplation and effective love are two, the pleasure and the desires of it. God uses at first to fill the soul with sensible pleasures, because 'tis so frail and miserable that without his preventative consolation it cannot take wing towards the fruition of heavenly things. In this first step it is disposed by contrition, and it is exercised in repentance, meditating upon the Redeemer's passion, rooting out diligently all worldly desires and vicious courses of life. But the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the faint heart, the delicate, never conquer it, but those that use violence and force within themselves. The second is desires. The more the things of heaven are delighted in, the more they are desired, and from thence there they do ensue upon spiritual pleasures, desires of enjoying heavenly and divine blessings, and contempt of worldly ones. From these desires arises the inclination of following Christ our Lord, who said, I am the way. The steps of his imitation by which a man must go up are charity, humility, meekness, patience, poverty, self-contempt, the cross, prayer, and mortification. The steps of infused contemplation are three. The first is satiety. When the soul is filled with God, it conceives a hatred to all worldly things. Then 'tis quiet and satisfied only with divine love. The second is intoxication, and this step is an excess of mind, an elevation of soul, arising from divine love, and the satiety of it. The third is security. This step turns out all fear. The soul is so drenched with love divine and resigned up in such a manner to the divine good pleasure that it would willingly go to hell if it did but know it to be so the will of the divine and most high. In this step it feels such a certain bond of the divine union that it seems to be an impossible thing to be separated from its beloved and his infinite treasure. There are 6 other steps of contemplation, which are these: fire, union, elevation, illumination, pleasure, and repose. With the first the soul is enkindled, and being enkindled is anointed, being anointed is raised, being raised. Contemplates, contemplating. It receives pleasure, and receiving pleasure, it finds repose. By these steps the soul rises higher, being abstracted and experienced in the spiritual and internal way. In the first step, which is fire, the soul is illustrated by the means of a divine and ardent ray, in the kindling the affections divine and drying up those which are but humane. The second is the unction, which is a sweet and spiritual liquor, which diffusing itself all the souls over, teaches it, strengthens it, and disposes it to receive and contemplate the divine truth. And sometimes it extends even to nature itself, corroborating it by patience, with a sensible pleasure that seems celestial. The third is the elevation of the inner man over itself, that it may get fittest to the clear fountain of pure love. The fourth step, which is illumination, is an infused knowledge, whereby the soul contemplates sweetly the divine truth. rising still from one clearness to another, from one light to another, from knowledge to knowledge, begin guided by the divine Spirit. The fifth is a savory pleasure of the divine sweetness, issuing forth from the plentiful and precious fountain of the Holy Ghost. The sixth is a sweet and admirable tranquillity, arising from the conquest of fightings within, and frequent prayer, and this very, very few have experience of. Here the abundance of joy and peace is so great that the soul seems to be in a sweet sleep, soliciting and reposing itself in the divine breast of love. Many other steps of contemplation there are, as ecstasies, raptures, melting, deliriums, glee, kisses, embraces, exaltations, union, transformation, espousing, and matrimony, which I omit to explain to give no occasion to speculation, because there are whole books which treat of these points, though they are all for him who finds nothing of them, any more than a blind man doth of colour, or a deaf man of music. In a word, by these steps we get up to the chamber and repose of the pacific king and the true Solomon. Chapter 16. Signs to know that the inner man and the mind that's purged. The signs to know the inner man are four. The first, if the understanding produce no other thoughts than those which stir up to the light of faith, and the will is so habituated that it begets no other acts of love, and in order to him the second, if, when he ceases from an external work, in which he was easily employed, the understanding and the will are presently and easily turned to God. The third, if in entering upon prayer he forgets all outward things, as if he had not seen or used them. The fourth, if he carries himself orderly towards outward things, as if he were entering the world again, fearing to embroil himself in business and naturally abhorring it, unless when charity requires it of him. Such a soul as this is free from the outward man, and easily enters into the interior solitude, where it sees none but God and itself in him, loving him with a quiet and peace and true love. There in that secret center God is kindly speaking to it, teaching it a new kingdom and a true peace and joy. The spiritual abstracted and retired soul hath its peace no more broken, though outwardly it may meet with combats, because though the infinite distance tempests and do never reach to that serenest heaven within, where pure and perfect love resides, and though sometimes it may be naked, forsaken, fought against and desolate, this is only the fury of the storm, which threatens and rages nowhere but without. The secret love within hath four effects. The first is called illumination, which is a savory and experimental knowledge of the greatness of God, and of its own nothing. The second is inflammation, which is an ardent desire of being burnt, like the salamander, in this kind and divine fire. The third is sweetness, which is a peaceable, joyful, sweet, and intimate function. The fourth is a swallowing up of the powers in God, which by immersion the soul is so much drenched and filled with God that it cannot any longer seek or will anything but its greatest and infinite good. From this fullest satiety two effects arise. The first is a great courage to suffer for God. The second is a certain hope or assurance that it can never lose him nor be separated from him. Here in this internal retirement, the beloved Jesus hath his paradise, to whom we may go up, standing and conversing on the earth. And if thou desirest to know who he is, who is altogether drawn to this inward retirement, and with enlightened exemplification in God, I tell thee, it is he that in adversity and in discomfort of spirit, and in the want of necessity stands firm and unshaken. These constant and inward souls are outwardly naked, and wholly diffused in God, whom they do continually contemplate. They have no spot, They live in God, and of himself they shine brighter than 1,000 suns. They are beloved by the Son of God. They are the darlings of God the Father, and the elect spouses of the Holy Ghost. By 3 signs is a mind that is purged to be known, as St. Thomas says in a treatise of his. The first sign is diligence, which is a strength of mind which banishes all neglect and sloth, that it may be disposed with an earnestness and a confidence to the pursuit of virtue. The second is severity, which likewise is a strength of mind against concupiscence, accompanied by an ardent love of roughness, vileness, and holy poverty. The third is benignity and sweetness of mind, which drives away all rancor, envy, aversion, and a hatred against one's neighbor. Till the mind be purged and the affection purified, the memory naked, the understanding brightened, the will denied, and a fire set, the soul can never arrive at the intimate and effective action and union with God. And therefore, because the Spirit of God is purity itself, and light and rest, the soul, where he intends to make his abode, must have great purity, peace, attention, and quiet. Finally, the precious gift of a purged mind, those only have who with continual diligence do seek love and retain it, the desire to be reputed the most vile in the world. Chapter 17. Of Divine Wisdom. Divine wisdom is an intellectual and infused knowledge of the divine perfections and things eternal, which ought to be called contemplation than speculation. Science is acquired and begets the knowledge of nature. Wisdom is infused and begets the knowledge of the divine goddess, that desires to know what is not to be attained unto without pains and sweat. This desires not to know what it doth know, although it understands it all. In a word, the men who are scientifical entertain themselves in the knowledge of the things of the world, and the wise live swallowed up in God himself. Reason enlightened in the wise is a high and simple elevation of spirit, whereby he sees with a clear and sharp sight all that is inferior to him, and what concerns his life and his estate. This is that which renders the soul simple, illustrated, uniform, spiritual, and altogether introverted, and abstracted from everything. This moves and draws away with a sweet violence the hearts of the humble and the teachable, filling them with an abundance of sweetness, peace, pleasantness. Finally, the wise man says of it that it brought him all good things at once. You must know that the greatest part of men lives by opinion, and judges according to the deceivableness of imagination and sense. But the man that's wise judges of everything according to the real verity, which is in it, whose business is to understand, conceive, penetrate into, and transcend every created being, even to himself. 'Tis a great property of a wise man to do much and say little. Wisdom is discovered in the works and words of the wise, because he is being absolute master of all his passions, motions, and affections, is to know that in his all doings like a quiet and still water, in which wisdom shines with clearness. The understanding of mystical truths is secret, and shut up from men who are purely scholastical, unless they be humble, because it is the science of saints. And none know it but those which heartily love and seek their own contempt. Therefore the souls, who by embracing this means get to be purely mystical and truly humble, dive even to the most profoundest apprehensions of the divinity, and the more sensually men do live according to flesh and blood, the greater distance they are at from this mystical science. Ordinarily it is seen that the man which hath much scholastic aid and speculative knowledge, divine wisdom, doth not dominate, yet they make an admirable composition when they both have met together. The men of learning who by God's mercy have attained to this mystic science are worthy of veneration and praise in religion. The external actions of the mystical and the wise, which they do rather passively than actively, though they are a great torment to them, are yet ordered prudently by them, by number, weight, and measure. The sermons of men learning who want the Spirit, though they are made up of diverse stories, elegant descriptions, acute discourses, and exquisite proofs, are yet by no means the word of God, but the word of men, plated over with false gold. These preachers spoil Christians, feeding them with a wind and vanity, so they are, both of them, void of God. These teachers feed their hearers with the wind of hurtful subtleties, giving them stones instead of bread, leaves instead of fruit, an unsavory earth mixed with poisoned honey instead of true food. These are they that hunt after honor, raising up an idol of reputation and applause, instead of seeking God's glory and the spiritual edification of men. Those that preach with zeal and sincerity preach for God. Those that preach without them preach for themselves. Those that preach the word of God with spirit makes it take impression in the heart, but those that preach it without spirit carry it no further than to the ear. Perfection doth not consist in teaching it, but in doing it. Because he is neither the greatest saint nor the wisest man that knows the truth most, but he that practices it. It is a constant maxim that divine wisdom begets humility. That which is acquired by the learned begets pride. Holiness does not consist in forming deep and subtle conceits of the knowledge and attributes of God, but in the love of God and in self-denial. Therefore, 'tis frequently observed that his holiness is more amongst the simple and the humble than amongst the learned. How many poor old women are there in the world which have little of nothing of humane science, but are rich in the love of God? How many divines do we see that are over head and ears in their vain wisdom, and yet very bare in things of true light and charity? Remember that it is always good to speak like one that learns, and not like one that knows. Count it a greater honor to be a repeated a mere ignoramus than a man of wisdom and prudence. However, the learned who are purely speculative have some little sparks of spirit, yet these do not fly out from the simple bottom of eminent and divine wisdom, which hath a mortal hatred to forms and species. The mixing of a little science is always a hindrance to the eternal, profound, pure, simple, and true wisdom. Chapter 18. There are two ways which lead to the knowledge of God, one remote, the other near. The first is called speculation, the second contemplation. The learned who follow the scientifical speculation by the sweetness of sensible discourse get up to God by this means, as well they can, that by this help they may be able to love him. But none of those who follow that way which they call scholastical ever arrives by that only, to the simple mystical way, or to the excellence of union, transformation, simplicity, light, peace, tranquility, and love, as he doth, who is brought to the divine grace by the mystical way of contemplation. These men of learning who are merely scholastical do not know what the Spirit is, nor what it is to be lost in God. Nor are they come yet to the taste of the sweet ambrosia, which is the most depth and bottom of the soul, where it keeps its throne. It communicates itself with incredible, intimate, and delicious affluence. Nay, some there are which do condemn this mystical science, because they neither understand it nor relish it. The divine who doth not taste the sweetness of contemplation has not other reason to give for it, but because he enters not by the gate which St. Paul points to If anyone among ye seems himself to be wise, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. Let him shew his humility by repeating himself ignorant. It is a general rule, but also a maxim in mystical theology, that the practice ought to be gotten before the theory. That there ought to be some experimental exercise of supernatural contemplation before the search of the knowledge, and an inquiry after the full apprehension of it. Although the mystical science does commonly belong to the humble and the simple, yet, notwithstanding that men of learning are not capable of it, if they do not seek themselves nor set any great value upon their own artificial knowledge, but more if they can forget it, as if they never had it, and only make use of it in its own proper place and time, for preaching and disputing when their turn comes, and afterwards give their minds to the simple and naked contemplation of God, without form, figure, or consideration. The study, which is not ordered for God's glory only, but is a short way to hell, not through the study, but the wind of pride which begets it. Miserable is the great part of men at this time, whose only study is to satisfy the unsatisfiable curiosity of man. Many seek God and find him not, because they are more moved by curiosity than sincere, pure, and upright intention. They rather desire spiritual comforts than of God himself. And as they seek him not with truth, they find neither God nor spiritual pleasures. He that does not endeavor the total denying of himself will not be truly abstracted, and so can never be capable of the truth and the light of the Spirit. To go towards the mystical science, a man must never meddle with things which are about, but with prudence, and that in which his office calls him to. Rare are the men who set a higher price upon hearing than speaking. But the wise and purely mystical man never speaks but when he cannot help it, nor doth he concern himself in any way but what belongs to his office, and then he carries himself with great prudence. The spirit of divine wisdom fills men with sweetness, governs them with a courage, and enlightens those with excellence who are subject to its direction. Where the divine spirit dwells, there is always a simplicity and a holy liberty, but craft and double-mindedness, fiction, artifices, policy, and worldly respects are hell itself to wise and sincere men. Know that he who would attain to the mystical science must be denied and taken off from 5 things, from the creatures, from temporal things, from the very gifts of the Holy Ghost, from himself, and he must be lost in God. This last is the completest of all, because that soul only that knows how to be so taken off is that which attains to being lost in God, only knows where to be in safety. God is more satisfied with the affection of the heart than of worldly science. 'Tis one thing to cleanse the heart of all which captivates and pollutes it, and another to do 1,000 things, though good and holy, without minding that purity of heart which is the main of all for attaining of divine wisdom. Never wilt thou get to this sovereign and divine wisdom if thou hast not strength, when God cleanseth thee in his own time, but only of thy adherency to temporal and natural blessings, but further to supernatural and sublime ones, as internal communications, ecstasies, raptures, and other gratuitous graces whereon the soul rests and entertains itself. Many souls come short of arriving to quiet contemplation, to divine wisdom, and to true knowledge. Notwithstanding that they spend many hours in prayer, and receive the sacrament every day, because they do not subject and submit themselves wholly and entirely to him that hath light, nor deny and conquer themselves, nor give themselves up totally to God with a perfect divesting and disinteresting of themselves. In a word, till the soul be purified in the fire of inward pain, it will never get to a state of renovation, of transformation, of contemplation, of divine wisdom, and effective union. Chapter 19. of true and perfect annihilation. Thou must know that all this fabric of annihilation hath its foundation in but two principles. The first is to keep oneself and all worldly things in a low esteem and value, from whence the putting on the practice of this self-divesting and self-renunciation and forsaking of all things must have its rise. That with the affection and indeed. The second principle must be a great esteem of God, to love, adore, and follow him with the least interest of one's own. Let it ever be so holy, that these two principles will arise a full conformity to the divine will. This powerful and practical conformity to the divine will in all things leads the soul to annihilation, leads the soul to transformation. Without the mixture of raptures or external ecstasies or vehement affections, this way being liable to many illusions, with the danger of weakness and anguish of the understanding, by which path there is seldom any that gets up to the top of perfection, which is acquired by any other safe and firm and real way, though not without a weighty cross, because therein the highway of annihilation and perfection is founded, which is seconded by many gifts of light and of divine effects, and infinite other graces. Yet the soul that is annihilated must be unclothed of all, if it would not have them be a hindrance to its way to deification. As the soul makes continual progress from its meaningness, it ought to walk on to the practice of annihilation, which consists in the abhorring of honor, dignity, and praise, there being no reason that dignity and honor should be given to vileness and a mere nothing. To the soul that is sensible of its own vileness, it appear an impossible thing to deserve anything. 'Tis rather confounded, and knows itself unworthy of virtue and praise. It embraces with equal courage all occasions of contempt, persecution, infamy, shame, and affront, and as truly deserving of such reproaches, it renders the Lord's thanks, when it lights upon such occasions to be treated as it deserves, and it knows itself also unworthy, that he should use his justice upon it. But above all, 'tis glad of contempt and of affront, because its God gets great glory in it. Such a soul as this always chooses the lowest, the vilest, the most despised degree, as of well of a place and as of clothing and of other things, without the least affection of singularity, being of the opinion that the greatest vileness is beyond its deserts, and acknowledging itself is also unworthy of this, is the practice that brings the soul to a true annihilation of itself. The soul that would be perfect begins to mortify its passions, and when 'tis advanced in that exercise, it denies itself. Then, with divine aid, it passes to the state of nothing, where it despises, abhors, and plunges itself upon the knowledge that is nothing. It can do nothing. It is worth nothing. From hence springs the dying in itself, and in its senses, in many true ways, and at all hours, and finally from this spiritual death, the true and perfect annihilation derives its original, insomuch that when the soul is once dead to its will and understanding, 'tis properly said to be arrived at the perfect and happy state of annihilation, which is the last disposition for transformation and union, which the soul itself doth not understand, because to it would not be annihilated if one should come to know it. And although it do get to this happy state of annihilation, yet it must be known that it must still walk on, and be farther and further purified and annihilated. You must know that this annihilation, to make it perfect in the soul, must be in man's own judgment, his will, his works, inclinations, desires, thoughts, and in itself. so that the soul must find itself dead to its will, desire, endeavor, understanding and thought, willing as if it did not will, desiring as if it did not desire, understanding as if it did not understand, thinking as if it did not think, without inclining to anything, embracing equally contempts and honors, benefits and corrections. Oh, what a happy soul is that which is dead and thus annihilated. It lives no longer in itself, because God lives in it. And now it may most truly be said of it, that a renewed phoenix, because 'tis changed, spiritualized, transformed, and deified. Chapter 20. In which is shewed how this nothing is the ready way to obtain the purity of soul, perfect contemplation, and on the rich treasure of internal peace. The way to attain that high state of a mind reformed, whereby a man immediately gets to the greatest good, to our first original, and to the highest peace, is his nothingness. Endeavor, O soul, to always be buried in that misery. This nothing and this acknowledged misery is the means by which the Lord works wonders in thy soul. Clothe thyself with this nothing, and with this misery, and see that this misery and this nothing be thy continual food and habitation, even down to the casting of thyself low therein. And then I assure thee that thou being in that manner the nothing, the Lord, will be the whole in thy soul. Why, thinkest thou, do infinite souls hinder the abundant current of the divine gifts? 'Tis only because they would be doing something, and have a desire to be great. All this is to come away from internal humility, and from their own nothing, and therefore they prevent those wonders which that infinite goodness work in them. They betake to themselves to the very gifts of the Spirit, and there they stick, so they may come out from the center of nothing, and so the whole work is spoiled. They seek not God with truth, and therefore they find him not. For thou must know that there is no finding of him, but in the undervaluing of ourselves and in nothing. We seek ourselves every time that we get out of our nothing, and therefore we never get so quiet and perfect contemplation. Creep in as far as ever thou canst into the truth of thy nothing, and then nothing will disquiet thee. Nay, thou wilt be humble and ashamed, losing openly thy own reputation and esteem. Oh, what a strong bulwark wilt thou find of that nothing! Who can ever afflict thee, if once thou dost retire into that fortress? Because the soul, which is despised by itself, and in its own knowledge is nothing, is not capable of receiving grievance or injury from any body. The soul which keeps within its nothing is eternally silent, lives resigned in any torment whatsoever. By thinking it less than what it doth deserve, it shuns the suspicion of a neighbor, it never looks at other faults, but its own is free from abundance of imperfections, and becomes commander of great virtue. Whilst the soul keeps still and is quiet in its nothing, it perfects it, it enriches it, the Lord draws his own image and likeness in it, without anything to hinder it. By the way of nothing thou must come to lose thyself in God, which is the last degree of perfection, and happy wilt thou be, if thou canst lose thyself, then thou wilt get thyself again, and find thyself most certainly in this same shop of nothing. Simplicity is made, interior and infused recollection is possessed, quiet is obtained, and the heart is cleansed from all manner of imperfections. Oh, what a treasure wilt thou find, if thou shalt once fix thy habitation in nothing! And if thou once gettest but I snug into the center of nothing, thou wilt never concern thyself with anything that is without, the great, ugly, large step that so many thousands of souls do stumble at, unless it be as thy office may call thee to do it. If thou dost but get shut up in nothing, where the blows of adversity can never come. Nothing will vex thee or break thy peace. This is the true way of getting to the command of thyself, because perfect and true dominion doth only govern in nothing. With the helmet of nothing, thou will be too hard for strong temptations and the terrible suggestions of the envious enemy. Knowing that thou art nothing, that thou canst do nothing, and art worth just nothing, thou wilt quietly embrace passive dryness. Thou wilt endure horrible desolations. Thou wilt undergo spiritual martyrdoms and inward torments by means of this nothing. Thou must die in thyself, many ways at all times and all hours. Who must awaken the soul out of that sweet and pleasant sleep, for if once it comes to take a nap in nothing. This is the way that David got a perfect annihilation, without so much as knowing it, keeping thyself in nothing. Thou wilt bar the door against everything that is not good. Thou wilt retire also from thine own self, and walk towards that of internal solitude, where the divine spouse speaks in the heart of his bride, teaching her and his divine wisdom. Drown thyself in this nothing, and there shalt thou find a holy sanctuary against any tempest whatsoever. By this way, thou must return to the happy state of innocence forfeited by our first parents. By this gate thou must enter into the happy land of the living, where thou wilt find the greatest good, the breath of charity, the beauty of righteousness, the straight line of equity and justice, and in sum every jot and tittle of perfection. Lastly, do not look at nothing, desire nothing, will nothing, nor endeavor nothing, and then in everything thy soul will live reposed with quiet and enjoyment. This is the way to get purity of the soul, perfect contemplation, and peace eternal. Walk therefore in this safe path, and endeavor to overwhelm thyself in nothing. Endeavor to lose thyself, to sink deep into it, if thou hast a mind to be annihilated, united and transformed. The soul being once annihilated and renewed with perfect nakedness, finds in its superior part a profound peace and a sweet rest, which brings it to such a perfect union of love that it is joyful all over. And a soul such as this has already arrived to such a happiness that it neither wills nor desires anything but what is beloved wills. It conforms itself to this will in all emergencies, as well as comfort as anguish, and rejoices also in everything to do the divine good pleasure. Chapter 21. Of the high felicity of internal peace, and the wonderful effects on it. There is nothing but what comforts it, nor doth it want anything. But what can it well want? To die is enjoyment to it, and to live is its joy. As it is contented here upon earth, as it can be in paradise. It is as glad under privation as it can be in possession, in sickness as it can be in health. Because it know that this is the will of its Lord. This is its life. This is its glory, its paradise, its peace, its repose, its rest, its consolation, and its highest happiness. If it were necessary to such a soul as this, which is gotten by the steps of annihilation to the region of peace, to make its choice, it would choose desolation before comfort, contempt before honor, because the loving Jesus made great esteem of reproach and pain. If it first endured the hunger of the blessings of heaven, if it thirsted for God, if it had the fear of losing him, the lamentation of heart and the fighting of the devil, Now these things are altered, and hunger is turned into satisfying, the weeping into merriment, the fierce fighting into the greatest peace. O happy soul that enjoys here on earth so great a felicity, thou must know that these kinds of souls are be the strong pillars which support the church, and such as abate the divine indignation. And now this soul that is entered into the heaven of peace acknowledges itself full of God and his supernatural gifts, because it lives grounded in a pure love, receiving equal pleasure in light and dark, night and day, affliction and consolation. Though this holy and heavenly indifference, it never loses its peace, nor its adversity, its tranquillity in tribulations, but instead sees itself full of unspeakable enjoyments. And although the Prince of Darkness makes all the assaults of hell stand against it, with horrible temptations, yet it makes head against them, and it stands like a strong pillar, no more happening to it by them, and then happens to a high mountain and a deep valley in times of storm and tempest. The valley is darkened with thick clouds, fierce tempests of hail, thunder, lightning, hailstones, which looks like the picture of hell, and at the same time the lofty mountain glitters by the bright beams of the sun, in quietness and serenity, continuing clear like heaven, immovable and full of light. The same happens to this blessed soul. The valley of the part below is suffering tribulations, combats, darkness, desolations, torments, martyrdoms, and suggestions, and at the same time, on the lofty mountain of the higher part of the soul, the true sun casts its beams. It inflames and enlightens it, and so becomes clear, peaceable, resplendent, quiet, serene, being a mere ocean of joy. So great, therefore, is the quiet of this soul, which is gotten up to the mountain of tranquillity, so great is the peace of its spirit, so great the serenity and cheerfulness that is within, that a remnant of the glimmering of God do rebound even to the outside of it. Because in the throne of quiet are the manifest the perfections of spiritual beauty. Here are the true light of the secret and divine mysteries of our holy faith. Here perfect humility, even to the annihilation of itself, the amplest resignation, chastity, poverty of spirit, the sincerity and innocence of the dove, internal modesty, silence and internal fortitude, liberty and purity of heart, here the forgetfulness of every living created thing, even of itself, joyful simplicity, a heavenly indifference, continual prayer, a total nakedness, a perfect disinterestedness, a most wise contemplation, a conversation of heaven, and lastly, a most perfect and serene peace within, of which this happy soul may say that the wise man said of wisdom, that all other graces came along in the company with her. This rich and hidden treasure is the lost groat of the gospel. This it is the blessed life, the happy life, the true life, the blessedness here below, O thou lovely greatness that passest the knowledge and sons of men. O excellent supernatural life, how admirable and unspeakable art thou, for thou art the very draught of blessedness. O how much dost thou raise a soul from the earth, which loses in its view all things of the vileness of earth. Thou art poor to look upon, but inwardly thou art full of wealth. Thou seemest low, but art exceeding high. In a word, thou art which makest men live a life divine here below. Give me, O Lord, thou greatest goodness. Give me a good portion of this heavenly happiness and true peace, that the world, essential as it is neither capable of understanding nor receiving. Chapter 22. A mournful exclamation and lamentable moan to God for the small company of souls that arrive at perfection, the loving union, and the divine transformation. O divine majesty, in whose presence the pillars of heaven do quake and tremble. O thou goodness more than infinite, in whose love the seraphims burn, give me leave, O Lord, to lament and blind our foolishness and ingratitude. We all live in mistakes, seeing the foolish world and forsaking thee, who art our God. We all forsake thee, the fountain of living waters, for the stinking dirt of the world. O we children of men, how long shall we follow after lying in vanity? Who is it hath thus deceived us, that we should forsake our God, the greatest good? Who is it that speaks the most truth to us? Who is it that loves us the most? Who defends us the most? Who is it that doth more to shew of himself a friend? Who more tender to shew himself a spouse, and to be more good to be a father? That our blindness should be so great that we should forsake all this greatest and infinite goodness. O divine Lord, what a few souls there are in the world which do serve thee with perfection. How small is the number of those who are willing to suffer that they might follow Christ crucified, that they may embrace the cross, that they may deny and contempt themselves. Oh, what a scarcity of souls is there, which are disinterested and totally naked. How few are those souls which are dead to themselves and alive, which are totally resigned to this divine good pleasure. How few are those that adorn themselves with simple obedience, profound knowledge of themselves, and true humility. How few those which with an entire indifference gave themselves up into the hands of God, to do what he pleases with them. How few are there of those pure souls which be of a simple and disinterested heart, and which, putting off their own understanding, knowledge, desire, and will, do long for self-denial and spiritual death. Oh, what a scarcity of souls is there which are willing to let the divine Creator work in them a mind to suffer, that they may not suffer, and to die, that they may not die. How few are the souls which are willing to forget themselves, to free their hearts from their own affections, their own desires, their own satisfactions, their own love and judgments, that are willing to be led by the highway of self-denial and the eternal way, that are willing to let themselves be emptied, purified, and unclothed, that God may fill and clothe and perfect them. In a word, how small, O Lord, is the number of those souls which are blind, deaf, and dumb, and perfectly contemplative. Oh, the shame of us children of Adam, who, for a thing of mere vileness, do despise true felicity, and hinder our greatest good, the rich treasure and infinite goodness. Great reason hath heaven to lament that there are so few souls to allow its precious pathway. I submit everything with humble prostration to the correction of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. We have come to the end of the spiritual guide of Miguel de Molinos. I thank all of you for joining me on this journey. I appreciate your patience. Any and all errors are mine and mine alone. Thank you.